speakers. First is Maya Gez, partner at White & Case, and Zali Ahmadi, Director of Corporate Governance and Executive Compensation at DF King.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack, and thank you everybody for having us today. Hopefully next time we can meet you all in person. And yeah, we look forward to presenting on what we find to be a hot and exciting topic, and I find to be interesting for all companies, whether you get shareholder proposals or not, and we'll talk about that shortly. So we're going to have 4 parts to our presentation, and we'll dive in right into the first part, talking about COVID, and then followed by ESG, executive compensation, and then board accountability. So this is one of my favorite background slides, is just to set the stage for you. Back in March, when there was a pause of kind of everybody holding their breath of what's going to happen, in terms of the proxy season, what's going to happen in terms of disclosure, and also what is going to happen in terms of ESG. And there was a slight pause, and quickly by April, we all had evidence that really ESG has just been amplified. Basically, there's been a magnifying glass on the importance of ESG due to COVID. There's been increased investment in ESG funds. ESG investment have accelerated, double the amount since 2019, 4 times the amount in the last 4 years. So we're seeing an acceleration of that. And on the company side, we're seeing, the type of ESG issues that were not considered significant in terms of disclosure before, now being the types of issues that companies have to be focused on: employee health and safety. We're seeing more than ever before companies discuss that in their earnings releases, in their 10Qs, and really have to focus on that on their earnings calls too. We're seeing an additional investor focus on diversity. Black Lives Matter movement. We're seeing a lot of focus on that, and trends and demands and letters focused on increasing diversity and focused in this area, and also climate change initiatives. So we're seeing all 3 ESG really come to the fore here. And I'll turn it over to Zali.
Sure. Probably one of the biggest changes that we saw COVID have an impact on was just how we actually conducted the annual meeting. So we just have a couple stats on the virtual meetings there. I mean, as expected, right, over 700% increase over the previous year, just because, in so many states, you can have more than 10 people in a room. So we're getting asked a lot about, going into 2021, where a lot of companies are thinking about staying the course, sticking with the virtual meetings, also because a lot of them have to at this point. So what should they know, right? One thing is that ISS and Glass Lewis both have come out with statements stating that, we want companies to commit to going back to a hybrid meeting or an in-person meeting after all of this is over. We want to see that kind of disclosure. That being said, no vote recommendations are based on that right now, and we're not really seeing those commitments being made in mass numbers. CII, the Council of Institutional Investors, they've kind of come out and posed a lot of concerns with how a number of the virtual meetings were conducted this year. Things along the lines of kind of a lack of transparency, right? Making sure proponents and investors and shareholders do have a voice, that, questions on whether, or concerns on whether questions are being cherry picked or anything along that nature. So just keep in mind that these are things that investors are eyeing as we go into 2021, just kind of making sure that transparency is there. Glass Lewis recently updated their policy, well, not updated, but more so just kind of reinforced a policy that they did have, that they had waived during the pandemic. They're basically stating that if you are going to have a virtual meeting in 2021, if you don't provide sort of robust disclosure to where, you'll guarantee that shareholders have the same amount of access and visibility that they did at an in-person meeting, then they might recommend against directors. So just keep all these things in mind as we go into 2021. We do see similar numbers continuing on the virtual meeting path. And then just an increase in poison pills that we did see at the beginning of the year. similar to what we saw after the 2008 fiscal crash. You know, markets were very volatile, so we saw this mass increase in poison pills being adopted. And, you know, a lot of investors did put out guidance on what they expect, you know, for example, a sunset provision, those types of things. So those are kind of the main impacts that we saw on governance just earlier on in the year. And this, you know, at least for the virtual meeting portion, we do see that continuing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sally. So, you know, just to take a step back on the shareholder proposals, you know, why do we pay attention? A lot of companies don't receive them, and, you know, the largest companies do. S&P 500 companies, your largest companies do receive them. But why should everybody pay attention to these? Well, these are issues, these are trends that we can see in the market and that will proliferate or often proliferate. For example, you know, at one time, plurality voting for director elections was very accepted. And now, you know, through shareholder proposals, that changed. And now majority voting is the standard for director elections. So, you know, we see that shareholder proposals really become important for everybody to monitor and see what is the next trend, what is the next governance trend that we should pay attention to. And looking at overall, you know, even though we're having slightly less proposals submitted overall, you see that going down from 703 to 682, we're seeing continued strong support. You know, these numbers have continued to be strong, and we're also seeing, you know, a continued large percentage or significant percentage go to a vote, you know, 59%, so nearly 60% going to a vote. So what does that mean? If you're getting a proposal, that means it has some teeth now. Whereas at one time, a few years ago, not necessarily. So that's a change that we're seeing. In addition, I think this year, which, you know, in past years, we had kind of the year of the social or the year of the environmental. This really is a year of all three, right? We're seeing an increased number of governance proposals for a period, and we had proxy access, and then that kind of, once that was, you know, market accepted, that sort of went away a little bit, that got quieter. But now we're seeing additional governance proposals become the standard governance proposals and really, you know, seeing an increase there. We're seeing also, you know, social and environmental proposals, you know, decreasing withdrawal rates. So that means that they have more teeth when they're submitted, and less proposals overall being withdrawn. And here we see kind of an overview of the different buckets of proposals. You can see that we saw a resurgence in governance proposals. More were voted on, including independent chair proposals, which we'll talk about in a bit. Social proposals, you know, almost half went to a vote. So you can see the blue is showing, you know, how many were voted on versus the gray is what was submitted. So you can see for governance proposals, often they do have teeth. For the most part, they do get voted on. You know, social, environmental, less so. But the significance here is that still, you know, so an increasing number, and almost half of the social proposals went to a vote. And for environmentals, even though that blue, you know, is smaller there, the big story there was 6 environmental proposals passed this year, which is a historic change.
Sure. So actually, another thing that I realized the other day with, you know, with this sort of lack of physical requirements, right? Going forward for proponents, I guess one thing that we should be looking out for is whether there will be any sort of dramatic increase in shareholder proposals, right? Without sort of this need to be at a physical location to present your proposal anymore. This slide, it is very complicated looking, but I will walk you through some of the main takeaways that we have. We like to do this every year. We look at it year over year to kind of take away some of the macro trends, to just identify what investors are talking about behind closed doors. These are the top shareholder proposals submitted. So just, you know, the highest number in volume for any specific topic, right? And you have the topics there with kind of the line for the average support levels. This year, you know, a couple of takeaways. One was that there's kind of an even spread here between governance and social, right? And we're seeing this incremental rise in interest in social issues. That's only been increased because of COVID, right? You know, the human element, human capital, and what companies are doing with regard to their workforce, that sort of thing. So, and, you know, we are seeing that reflected here. Whereas 5 years ago, this would primarily be governance dominated, we now have board diversity, EEO reporting, human rights proposals, even incorporating ESG and executive comp made it onto the top proposal list. One other thing that we noted this year was that we did see certain spikes for certain proposals. For example, supermajority voting, we saw like a 20% increase in the average support level there. EEO reporting and board diversity, major increases as well that we'll get into. This next slide I actually find very interesting. So the previous slide was the top proposals submitted, right? This slide, it shows what actually made it onto ballots. And so that shows, this paints such a different picture because what you're seeing here is what's not really negotiated out, right? It's what usually is not omitted or withdrawn, or, you know, it's where we see the proponents that are a little bit harder to engage with. So this landscape is pretty much dominated by what a lot of the corporate gadflies submit. And that's why you do see mostly governance proposals on here. So whereas in the previous slide, we did have the board diversity, EEO, human rights, that's all gone on this slide, right? And now this is primarily your written consent, independent chairs, a supermajority, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the main difference between the two slides. You do still see some environmental representation here, which kind of just shows us that, you know, it is really a lot more in the social realm at this time that concessions are being made. But this just kind of shows you, it's a good way to identify what is actually being voted on.
Great. So now we'll dive into the various, you know, types of proposals a little bit more in depth, and starting with the governance proposals. So this gives you a landscape of what are the top governance proposals that were you know, submitted, and then you can see the level of support. So you can see that supermajority vote at 78.7%. That's very high. I think the other significant trend here is that the support is also above, you know, 30% for many of these. So we're seeing, you know, the rise of really three types of proposals that are kind of becoming the new trend and bedrock for governance proposals. Those are the twins. I call them the twins because you have to think of them together, is the written consent and the special meeting proposals, right? So written consent proposals became the most common governance proposals submitted this year. And then along with that, there was an increase in proposal to lower the ownership threshold to call a special meeting. Now, when you get a written consent proposal, the chance of success of that proposal is really dependent on what your threshold is for your special meeting, which is what Sally can speak about in a little bit. There were two cases of written consent proposals passed, but in those cases, in one case there was no special meeting right, in the other, the special meeting right was at 35%, so higher than the market accepted, you know, percentage. So those are twins that need to be thought of together. I think the other really interesting trend here is the independent chair proposals, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You know, that we are seeing a resurgence in the number of submitted proposals there. And, you know, as we'll talk about in a little bit, I like to almost call those the board oversight proposals, board oversight of risk proposals. It's really getting at the core issue that the investors are getting that with that proposal is board oversight of risk. So here is that spotlight we're going to talk about. You know, for the independent chair proposals, you know, at one point, you know, we didn't see much, you know, proliferation, and we didn't see that much, you know, support. But here now we're seeing these two proposals pass, and we're seeing 11 proposals receive in excess of 40% support. So that is a significant change in terms of these proposals gaining teeth. Now, that's not to say that, you know, the market is not just moving suddenly, that companies just suddenly have to move to an independent chair. We a long time had the ISS policy, and it still is in place, that if you have a lead independent director with strong duties, right, and specified duties that ISS prescribes, then the ISS won't support that independent chair shareholder proposal, because you have a chair that might not be independent, but then you have a counterpart to that, which is a strong lead independent director. And, you know, this year, in terms of the two proposals that passed, well, you know, there were both companies starting with B, Baxter and Boeing. And in both of those, there were other issues going on. So, you know, with Baxter, there was a restatement, a financial restatement. So ISS supported the proponent in that case because they found that there was a material, risk issue, board oversight of risk, that they weren't sufficiently overseeing that risk because of the restatement. And the proponent in that case argued that the lead independent director had been in that role for 19 years, so had lost that independence, so could no longer be, thought of as independent. So all in all, that was a special situation. With Boeing, there you had an independent chair, but you had, the airplane crashes and the incidents there, and that was also seen as a risk oversight, a board risk oversight issue. So, in terms of thinking about these proposals and ways to protect companies is really looking at that disclosure in that proxy statement. And one of the things, I think the themes of this presentation that we'll talk about here is really thinking about certain aspects of your proxy statement for this year that might need to be beefed up or looked at. And this is one of them, board oversight of risk. Zali pointed to another one in the beginning of the presentation is your virtual meetings, is taking a look at that and taking a look at your disclosure there. Here's another one. Now,
one thing I wanted to add, Maya, to the independent chair, we actually just did this. This is just a good plug right now to really know your shareholder base going into 2021. We just looked at a lot of the NPX filings. We like to track voting trends to see if investors are flipping in certain positions, regardless of what their voting guidelines are. And so we were looking at the independent chair proposals just because, like Maya said, this year 2 of them passed, not a typical thing. And we identified at least one large investor who did flip their position, right? They're voting for almost all of these proposals with, no really new change in policy, published policy, or change in disclosure on that end. So it is a really good idea to understand your shareholder base as well. And, to also perhaps, identify some, advisors who can help you understand where that vote will go if you do get one of these proposals.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's also the first step in thinking what to do with your proxy statement is really understanding your shareholder base and understanding, who is your audience there with your proxy statement. So the other two twin proposals, as I call them, is the reducing the threshold to call a special meeting. Now we have 2/3 of the S&P 500 with a special meeting right. 25% is the most common threshold. We saw, an increase similar to the 2018 season. So we were really seeing an increase in this. And the threshold is often a determining factor as to whether, these proposals passed. So that is something that again, that needs to be thought about. 6 proposals there receive majority support. And this is going back to Zali's point. It's really key to understand, what your investors are focused on there and what percentages they want to see. Here you see that 3 sought to reduce the threshold from 25% to 10%. So, that's still 10% is still not overwhelmingly the market, but we are seeing kind of that 25%, which is the most common, to be, that being cut down and shareholder proponents looking to decrease that percentage. For right to act by written consent, there we're seeing, average support, actually decrease, since 2017, but 56 went to a vote in 2020 compared to 34 in 2019. So, there, we saw 2 instances where the proposal received majority support. Again, in one instance, there was no right to call a special meeting, and the other instance, it was the right to call a special meeting was at 35%. So you can see that what your threshold percentage is to call a special meeting, that will dictate the success of the written consent proposal. And I know that Zali is involved in strategizing on those a lot, and getting one of those 2 proposals, it really involves a lot of strategy to figure out how, what needs to be done and what disclosure needs to be provided to your investors.
Exactly. So just going on to this next slide, we're going to take a look at the social bucket. We've kind of separated this section into 3 buckets, right? The governance, the environmental, and social. So now we're looking at the top social proposals in 2020. You can see that the highest number submitted was for political contributions and lobbying. That typically takes the top spot for social proposals. The change this year was that 5 passed, an increasing number passed this year. And, it was an election year, right? That's to be expected. That being said, the election's over, but, a lot of the tension isn't. So we're anticipating continuing to see a large number of political contributions, lobbying, disclosure requests there. I think the biggest news of the social proposals for 2020 is probably what we saw in terms of board diversity and EEO reporting. And that kind of falls into the larger bucket of human capital management that we'll dive deeper into in the next few slides. But, for board diversity, for example, support more than doubled there to over 32%, which is fairly high for a shareholder proposal, especially an environmental social related one. EEO reporting, I mean, this is huge. It's averaging at over 50% support. Large for a shareholder proposal to receive that much, especially on average. And if we just move on to the next slide, I can elaborate a little bit more on some of that, on some of the initiatives push there. One being, for the EEO, right? The New York City comptroller reinforced his efforts behind this, right? He sent letters to CEOs of 67 of the S&P 100 companies, right? So a majority of them. And these are companies that have made statements in support of racial equality and diversity. And, the comptroller asked them to adopt a policy to publicly disclose their annual EEO reports. I guess one thing that I should mention is an EEO report is an annual compliance survey. It requires companies to provide the EEOC a breakdown of their employees, and this is by race, ethnicity, and gender according to various categories. So this includes senior management. It's essentially a diversity report on your employees. Just for a bit of background. And so the comptroller sent these, right? And essentially if companies are unresponsive, they stated that they may submit shareholder proposals going forward. So this is something to look for.
And talk about an effective letter writing campaign, because when you have a proposal that gets over 50% support in the prior season, and then you start a letter writing campaign on that exact issue, and say, or else we're going to submit a shareholder proposal that has gotten so much support, that's a successful campaign. And I saw one stat that over 30 have already responded saying that they will be disclosing this. So this is a very, a big successful, and from the New York City comptroller perspective, change in terms of disclosure, and this and is a trend that we should watch in the diversity area.
Exactly. And, even just going down to board diversity, for example, another letter writing campaign of theirs to 56 of the S&P 500 companies, asking companies to adopt a diversity search policy, right? So requiring the list of nominees to include female and racially, ethnically diverse candidates, even with diverse backgrounds from non-traditional fields. And this is what we call the Rooney Rule shareholder proposals. So they submitted proposals to 17 of those 56 companies. Negotiated settlements with 14 of them. So over 80% of the companies ended up conceding or agreeing to adopt this Rooney Rule policy. So it is a very effective letter writing campaign and engagement campaign. And, for board diversity in general, we did see support double this year to over 32%, whereas it previously it was, I think it was like 13.5% average. So just something to keep an eye out for going forward. And this all kind of falls under, I mentioned that larger umbrella of human capital management that, COVID really also is trying to spotlight on. Maya, if you want to dive a little bit deeper into that topic in the next few slides.
Sure. Yeah. So I think the other big thing is that when we say, diversity, I think in prior presentations and prior years that we were really focused on board diversity, right? Yes. Now it is much more expansive, right? It's not just, it's also CEO, it's also your executives, it's also all of your employees. So it's at every different level. That's what, investors are really highly focused on. And we are seeing, White & Case does an annual survey of human capital management disclosure, in SEC filings. And, we saw the largest increase coming in human capital management. So this is an issue, obviously that has come to the fore. A lot of this increase and, was really historic was, this year, the focus on employee health and safety due to COVID. So we definitely saw a lot of that. But in addition, we saw, human capital management disclosure that can continue in future years, employee training, employee pay and benefits. employee diversity. So we really are seeing an increase in focus on this disclosure. In terms of the proposals that Zali mentioned, it is broad. The most successful one is the first one in bold, as we've talked about. 52.6% average support is significant, and we expect that to become, the trend of, the successful trend right now of these proposals. Now, gender racial pay gap is an interesting one, because a couple of years ago, that seemed to be the proposal that was going to gain teeth here, right? When it came to workforce diversity, that was when Arjuna Capital submitted the proposal to Citibank, and Citibank became the first U.S. public company to disclose its unadjusted gender pay gap number. Now, that's been followed by MasterCard and Starbucks, which have also disclosed this number. But in 2020, we did not see a large number of new companies disclosing this. So we are seeing kind of a slight pause on that. In the end of the day, it's getting at some of the same themes and information that investors are looking for. Is diversity, and seeing, what are the differences in pay, because when you release that EEO reporting data, you will also be able to, understand, where are your minority diverse groups, women, where are they falling into the different levels of employment categories. So it is getting at the same point, and I think it's a nuance in terms of, which side of the disclosure are we getting at. And for now, it's clear. Also, we're seeing sexual harassment, gender identity, sexual orientation discrimination, those types of proposals, asking for increased disclosure and policies and reports on steps being done in this space. So, we are seeing, one proposal received 32% support. So we are seeing, this, kind of be broad. Now, turning to the 10K, what we've talked about for now is really shareholder proposals, and thinking about, those really affect your proxy disclosure and your engagement with investors. What the big change this year for me, at least in my practice, has been this hitting now 10K season, right? Is the historic rule changes that the SEC adopted to Regulation SK. Obviously we need to be updating our risk factors at this stage, but the other major change, with our business section is human capital. And the SEC was really focused on, principles-based disclosure to the extent material, actually watering down a lot of the requirements in the business section, except the caveat is for this one. That there was a rulemaking petition submitted to the SEC by a lot of the pension funds, a group of 25 institutional investors, and the SEC actually cited to this in their proposing release and their adopting release, saying the reason why human capital should be part of the business section and should be, can be an important driver of performance. And in adopting this rule change, they said, okay, we're going to keep the requirement that you disclose the number of employees. So originally the proposal, they said, okay, we're going to move away from that prescriptive requirement of the number and just have this general requirement to describe a registrant's human capital resources, including the number, and including any measures or objectives that a company focuses on in managing its business. So in the proposal, they said we would move away from that long-standing requirement to disclose the number of employees and replace it with more of a principles-based disclosure. Now, in the adopting rules, the SEC said, no, we're going to keep those number of employees, but then add to it this principles-based. So this is where, as I said, that this is the kind of the caveat and the theme of the Regulation SK adopted rule amendments, that we all need to think about it in terms of our 10K disclosure. And I think Chairman Clayton, really made the point. He said, I cannot remember engaging with a high quality, lasting company that did not focus on its human capital resources. So, the SEC, I think with the exception of companies that have, 1, 2, very few employees, I think for the most part, the SEC will be expecting this disclosure item to be added to the business section. And companies, our clients, I'm working with companies now and thinking about how to do this. Last year, as a precursor to this, when the rules were proposed, and I had foreseen them that they would be adopted in the future, I said, let's think about our risk factor disclosure, right? Let's think about beefing it up there, because that was a nice home for it, at least temporarily last year. This year, we're going to have to think about, what is your current disclosure? So what do you have now in your risk factor disclosure relating to human capital? What do you have in your proxy statement relating to your human capital disclosure? Also in your sustainability website disclosure. So that is your first step in thinking about how to meet this new requirement for your business section of the 10K, is to think, okay, what do we disclose already? And as a precursor to that, we should also be thinking about, in terms of for our companies, what is human capital? And the SEC is very broad in terms of, what this could be. Obviously, in the rules, they focus on retention and measures, to retain employees. That's the example they gave. But this is a much broader, definition. There is no one set definition, and the SEC rules don't define that. It's really what your senior management, what your board, what your company focuses on in managing its business. So in developing this disclosure, the first step, I think, is really thinking about what is our current reporting, what is our currently disclosure. Next step is really to think about what does the senior management, what does the board focus on? When you look at this list, this is a nice list of all the different types of varieties of human capital management topics. What are the different topics do we focus on? And then lastly, most importantly, is assess what is already available. What information do we have available, and what information can we vet properly to be able to disclose it? I think for many companies this year, less will be more this year until we see what is the market doing here, right? We don't, we're not looking out to, put our heads out, way out in front of the entire market. And so there is a bit of a wait and see. But thinking about what do we already disclose is a nice way to think about that. And also thinking about what can we actually vet and stand behind, and have certifications as to that disclosure, to make sure we can stand behind it. And I would also add, Zali, it's surprising this year. I mean, investors obviously focus on proxy statements, but this year, I would expect investors to also be looking to see what companies are going to be disclosing in their 10K, given this rule change.
Yeah, agreed. So pivoting a little bit and just to briefly cover what we saw in the environmental space. So these are the top environmental proposals in 2020, similar to the charts that we've displayed for the social and governance. And, the overall number of proposals kind of decreased, but the main takeaway was just that 6 of them received majority support. No environmental proposals received majority support in 2019. So it's a really good way for us to identify, what actually has teeth and what topics investors are really interested in right now. The highest in terms of the number of submissions is definitely climate change reporting, but the highest in terms of the level of support is anything related to GHG emissions. And that's averaging at 50% support, which is really high for a shareholder proposal. Examples of reporting requests include, disclose information on the risks of climate change, the typical report on GHG emissions, but there's also a few that actually explicitly request an adoption of specific GHG goals. So something to keep an eye out. One thing I do want to note is this introduction of SASB proposals that we saw this year. As you so kind of submitted a number of proposals requesting companies to align their disclosure with SASB recommendations. SASB has really kind of come to be the leading framework for disclosure. A lot of the top investors are putting their weight behind it to say that, if you do want to voluntarily disclose, we prefer that you follow the SASB guidance and framework, and they really kind of are getting closer to identify materiality, which is really kind of what's key here in terms of what companies should disclose. In any case, so we did see a number of proposals requesting, and at least 7 proposals out there, and a number withdrawn just because of concessions made as well there. Continued anti-ESG proposals, just really quick to note that we saw these pop up maybe 2 years ago, and those are literally anti-ESG in the sense that they're requesting companies to, for example, not consider climate change when considering their next transaction, or to report on the cost that all the climate change initiatives is how that's affecting a company. So those are receiving single digit supports, definitely no investor weight behind them, but they do exist. And then just this slide here kind of outlines a number of the heavy hitters when it comes to climate change. We do have the Climate Action 100. It's an initiative aimed at making sure that, the largest GHG emitters take the necessary action on climate change. Excuse me. It's backed by, over 300 investors, and it's pretty big in this space. The Business Roundtable also called upon businesses and governments to work together to limit the global temperature rise. And this, really relates to the 2 degrees Celsius scenario, kind of making sure that it doesn't increase by that amount, and consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. The U.S. is the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement really is what spurred this big rise in shareholder proposal support, and even submissions there. So you do see that a lot, that agreement referenced a lot in not just the shareholder proposals, right, but also the statements that are being put out by a lot of these groups. And, the one other thing I do want to note is that BlackRock and Vanguard as well, they've disclosed their voting decisions that, are in favor of climate change resolutions. They're a big part of why these proposals are passing, and why they've started passing a few years ago. And it is, this is a topic that they are reinforcing their engagement efforts on. So I know I mentioned SASB briefly, but Maya does a lot of work with this type of disclosure. So if you want to kind of go over SASB and also TCFD in this next slide.
Yeah, sure. So, I think we all remember Larry Fink, his letter, from BlackRock saying, we're calling on companies to publish disclosure in line with SASB. And I think that was, the announcement that really cleared the waters, because until now, I think companies that had engaged with investors, they understood, but it wasn't as clear to the entire market that, SASB and TCFD, are what, the institutional investors want to see. And BlackRock really was the leader coming out saying that we want to see this. If we do not see significant progress on SASB and TCFD reporting, it will be a consideration when BlackRock is considering whether to support certain shareholder proposals. So this is very important, for a company when it wants its support of institutional investors and it wants it on its side. There was a slight pause, an announcement from BlackRock saying they would expect some delays for companies in going forward with the reporting, but this is something that companies should be focused on, and it's something we're working, a lot with companies now on. State Street, they look at, an ESG score, they're saying it is, and it effectively is becoming as important as a credit rating. So, we all, roll our eyes and say, where are these ESG ratings and scores coming from? And they're, they can be a black box, right? But State Street is saying, this ESG score, and they're, is really as important, when they're considering as a credit rating. So that's very significant. So, institutional investors are really, looking and focused on, companies' disclosure of ESG. So it's becoming, a very basic requirement for companies, that are widely held. Obviously there are very different situations and different investor bases, but for companies that are widely held by institutional investors, it's becoming, a new must to think about how do we get a SASB and TCFD report together. And they're very different, right? SASB has very specific standards. It's not just environmental. It covers a wide range of topics, but it's by industry. So they said they actually have little industry groups, and they engage with their industry groups and are open to comments. We discussed also the rulemaking with SASB as well. And it's a really more like, SK, right? Another regulation SK, but it is voluntary technically. And companies need to think about disclosing, disclosing what SASB standard they're disclosing under, and focus on making sure and trying to disclose each topic. If they're not able to disclose on each topic, SASB is looking for a reason or an understanding. The information might not be available for some reason. We come up with different disclosures. Also, it's very important to think about, we throw around the word materiality. As a securities lawyer, SASB is trying to say this is material. Companies still need to decide for themselves based on facts and circumstances whether something is material, and if so, it goes in the 10K, it doesn't go on the website. So if you're posting a SASB report on your website, it's very important to have some disclaimer language to say, even though we're disclosing this, our material information is our 10K. If you want to find all of our material information, it's in our 10K. It's not necessarily in this SASB report. So you're doing the SASB report, and that's fine. BlackRock, the institutional investors, are not demanding still that it go into the 10K. But it's very important to have that disclaimer language, forward-looking statement legends. Those become even more important in your sustainability reporting. And this is where lawyers play an important role. And sometimes, you have your ESG experts internally, but you need to make sure, that attorneys are looking in that and making sure that the same disclosure principles and legends that you're putting in, are also thinking about that for your reporting. Now, TCFD is much more principles-based. It's a 4-part framework on governance, strategy, risk management. Now, the trick here is the scenario analysis. A lot of companies haven't done that, is different scenarios of how your company is going to manage and think about, the 2-degree scenario analysis and steps to keep global warming under 2 degrees. So that's something that companies have left still to do, at least many of our clients, and they're evaluating that and assessing that with our environmental group. But the other parts of TCFD are definitely worth thinking about how to disclose, and they're much more principles-based. And once you get that SASB report down, I've found it to be an easier process for TCFD. Now, moving on to no action relief. So when you get a shareholder proposal, there are different ways to exclude it. You could try to go ahead and negotiate it out with your proponent, which we're seeing some less success, as we noted before this year, than in prior years. Especially, governance proposals are always perennially difficult to withdraw. The other way to try to exclude a proposal is to go to the SEC and at least try to get no action relief. And there was a big policy change this year where the staff was not going to respond with a response letter to every single no action request to exclude. Instead, it would respond orally. Now, this orally became a chart posted on the SEC website. It's actually quite convenient. Everyone can pull up the chart, and it's just a very simple, posting of whether they agree or disagree with the no action request. 79% of the no action requests have not had a full letter response and have just been with that chart posted on the website. Excuse me, but it wasn't a significantly decreased processing time. So, all in all, we're seeing, 71% of no action requests granted. So, that just shows it's still very much, good to try, right? You never know. There's a lot of flux in this space. There's a lot of change in this space. And it's always good to try. I think the other big change this year was, in the past, the SEC has been focused on the board analysis, right? So when you have that ordinary business exclusion and you're trying to say that a proposal is micromanaging us or is ordinary business and it shouldn't be, is not appropriate for our proxy statement, and that this is up to management and not for a shareholder. When you do that, it's also important to have that board analysis to say, this is indeed ordinary business. This is not a significant policy issue. In the past, this argument has not been successful, but this year, the staff concurred with 4 exclusions with the board analysis, and also there was a situation where the SEC said, well, if the company had provided a board analysis, it would have been successful. So that is something to really be focused on. I think what other key word to think about is that delta analysis. So you need to think about, whether the proposal is, what has been done at the company so far and what is left to be done, with what the proposal requests, and think about that delta. And is that still significant? So that one with one of the board analyses, and that is something that we should be thinking about. You can see here that, substantial implementation, ordinary business were common reasons for success. And I also would not, I would also emphasize the importance that, procedural reasons to exclude a shareholder proposal should always be looked at. because if you can exclude a proposal based on kind of footfall or a reason that the shareholder proponent hasn't owned enough shares or hasn't disclosed it properly in the ownership letter, the proof of ownership, it's always good to try. Now, SEC rulemaking. Now, both of these new rules, and Zali and I were talking about this a lot before this presentation, both of these are actually not going to be applicable and effective until the 2022 proxy season. So I think that's a first step that we need to both understand, is that we need to understand. And the first one in particular, there's a stiff legal fight going on with ISS, and also, support from CII against these adopted rules that went effective in November of 2020, but won't be applicable until 2022. So that's a very important thing. And what this did was basically codify that ISS and Glass Lewis report is indeed a solicitation. And what that means is that it's under, the purview of the SEC to be able to regulate it. And if you do not meet the requirements for the SEC, because it's a solicitation, it might need to be filed. And obviously, ISS and Glass Lewis, this is their whole business model. They don't want to be filing publicly their voting recommendations. So the SEC codified that this is indeed a solicitation. However, if you meet the exemption in the rule, you don't need to file the voting report. So now the exemption, to meet the exemption, there are three basic requirements. One is disclosing material conflicts of interest. I think that will be pretty straightforward, and the lawyers of ISS and Glass Lewis will come up with appropriate language. The second one is simultaneously providing companies with a copy of those recommendations when they're sent out to clients. Now, this is taking a big step back from the proposal, which had been to actually provide a draft report to companies. Now it's actually providing it at the same time to companies. For now, Glass Lewis had been charging for this. So this is not something that had been, provided freely before. So this would be a change. And also to ensure that there's a mechanism for clients to become aware of the company's position and their response to the voting recommendations. Now, we don't yet know how ISS and Glass Lewis are going to comply with this. We just don't know. But I think we should, this is something that we're all monitoring to see, once they go into effect, how they will comply. The other rule change, which was historic, was changing the threshold requirements for a shareholder proponent to submit a proposal. So increasing from one year, $2,000, to you actually have to hold that for 3 years to be able to submit a shareholder proposal. I think the more significant changes will be to require, preventing a single person from submitting multiple proposals. So you can't just say, have a representative submit a shareholder proposal and then, also submit another shareholder proposal as a shareholder itself. So you can, it would actually be counted as a double proposal and it wouldn't be able to be counted. So it is making it slightly more difficult for shareholder proponents starting in 2022. That said, I'm sure Zali also expects, proponents to be able to work around this. There's enough advance notice now, and I expect proponents to be able to work around this. Lastly, I think this is, every year we're still waiting for the final updates to come out, but the proposed updates are out, and we can expect the new ISS policy to be pretty similar to this. And I think the big change, and this is in line with what California's own law that recently was adopted, is that effective in 2022, you'll need, public companies are going to have, at least one racially or ethnically diverse board member. Now that was, starting a year or two ago, that was for women, right? For gender diversity, right? You need to have at least one woman on the board, and that's the policy now, right? So if you don't have at least one woman on the board, you're going to get a, recommendation against from ISS Glass Lewis. But here, ISS is now, in its emphasis on diversity, is saying that we need to have at least one, and in the future, for under the California law, it will be, even increased numbers of racially diverse ethnic board members. And at least for this year, companies will be, the actual statistic will be highlighted. So they're going to highlight whether boards have no apparent racial or ethnic diversity. Now, this also really emphasizes the importance of disclosure. ISS said that if it's not clear in the disclosure whether you have a board member that is diverse or a diverse board, that they also will note that there's no apparent. That's why they use the word apparent. So they really want to see the disclosure that's clear on, gender diversity, racial, ethnic diversity to understand, the diversity of the board. Director accountability, I think they're upping the ante that a board member can get a recommendation against in this case. And lastly, exclusive forum provisions. There was a recent case in March of 2020. And I think it's now quite accepted. And if you don't have your bylaws updated, it's something to look at for your bylaws, because now ISS is also supportive of this. And this is also protective of companies to have that exclusive forum provision for the Securities Act. The Exchange Act already defaults to the federal courts, but for the Securities Act claims, you're going to want to, for many companies are going to want to have an exclusive forum for district court. You don't want those cases in state court.
So this next, I will very briefly go through a quick update for executive comp, and I say briefly just because there's not a lot to say. Support is still really high. It actually even increased slightly from previous years. We're seeing over 90% average support. But the one thing I do want to point out is that, since 2011, a third of S&P 500 companies have seen support levels dip below that 70% threshold. And here's why that's important. Below 70%, yes, it's still passing, but that's when ISS decides to do, that secondary screen. To ISS, anything below 70% is pretty concerning, just because it's so far below the average support level. And that's when they look to see a response in response to that level of vote, whether you change your compensation program, whether you engage, and you disclose the results of that engagement. So that's just something to remember, that 30% level, and ISS can affect up to 30%, of your shareholder support. On average, companies that don't receive ISS support, they get 30% lower. So it's kind of hand in hand there, right? Got to receive over 70% to avoid their scrutiny. At the very least. Glassdoor is even higher. It's like 80% for them. So, just keep that in mind when you're anticipating your results and when you're anticipating reaction to any changes you have made. And speaking of changes, if we go on to the next slide there, we just kind of have this brief update with COVID-19 and executive compensation. Earlier on in the year, we saw a lot of volatility, and there was a lot of decisions made because of that. Especially for companies who were affected in very industry specific companies, right? We saw kind of this decrease in base pay. It was more so affecting fixed pay than any sort of incentives for the most part. But we do see companies who spend time reviewing the status of in-cycle incentive awards, for example, right? And evaluating the need for changes for future years' incentive plans, just based off what we saw. Some companies decided to take more of a wait and see approach and revised, their in-cycle cash or equity awards, wait and see if they did not revise that, and just kind of moving those decisions to a later date. So, as of May, I think it was about a quarter of the S&P 500 companies that actually did issue compensation-related responses to the pandemic. So what does that mean for going forward? It means that investors are very interested to hear what you have done, if you have done anything. Obviously there's been a bit of a longer leash given for these types of changes, these types of mid-cycle changes, just because of what we saw in the pandemic. But that being said, there is that expectation of robust disclosure. And Maya, I know you were just referencing, the ISS guidance that was just put out on this.
Exactly. And that's the main theme, is I think ISS is asking for a reason to kind of look the other way. They came out with specific guidance, and saying that, if steps have been taken, a special bonus or, other executive compensation decisions that are related to COVID, they want to see clear justification and rationale. So there is a way out, but this year, what really needs to be done is you need to look at your CD&A and the COVID-related decisions and aspects of COVID that have affected your compensation decision. That really needs to be clearly stated, the justification, the rationale, and that's what ISS is looking for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So this next slide, just a quick look at what sort of shareholder proposals we're seeing for compensation. An increasing number of proposals asking to link exec comp to environmental and social issues. Now, none of these are passing at this time. It averages just under 20% support, but it's something to keep an eye out for just because we're seeing more of these, right? And we're seeing more ISS, for example, supporting some of these. So just something to keep in mind as we go forward when you are evaluating that type of disclosure. This last section that we have, just a few slides on board accountability and shareholder engagement and what we're seeing in that space. Maya, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, sure. So we'll just go over this. So, one of the, key reasons that ISS recommends against directors, this is your list, right? So, your board members or, public company board members can be sensitive to the percentage of support that they get. And for widely held companies that are not controlled, they're looking at that percentages and when they see that lower, they want to understand why. And many of these can be, prevented, right? Poor meeting attendance. Well, that's something to think about. Okay, did we have enough telephonic meetings to say, okay, do we have enough board members attending those to make sure they're all above that 75%? There really shouldn't be a reason to have low attendance, right? You need to think about, okay, it's still November now. There's still time to think about making sure our attendance is over 75%. And the next one, I think that is the foot fault is overboarding, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And I would say lastly, lack of response to shareholder concerns. If your shareholder proposal gets, majority significant support, your directors are going to hear from it if it's not implemented the next year. So overboarding, this is something that should be looked at now. How many other boards do your directors sit on? Now, the policies are different for each investor and for Glass Lewis and ISS, so it should be read carefully. That said, they're getting stricter and stricter, and I expect ISS to also get stricter. You can see they're the most, I would say, loose on their policy, but they're expected to get stricter as well. So you want to be, this is a chart to keep in mind, to put in front of your public company boards, to say, okay, we need to think about, and you need to get notified in advance if any of your directors is going to serve at another board, not only for this, but also for conflicts of interest reasons.
And the reason this slide is so important just right now is because it is evolving, right? Like just this proxy season, kind of midstream, State Street updated their policy and they've kind of joined this wave of stricter overboarding requirements. And they even now look at, board chairs and lead directors, because if you have that role, your allotment will be stricter than, for example, a regular non-independent director or a regular independent director. So just, this is why we bring this up every year, but it is evolving. So it is very appropriate to think about that right now. Shareholder engagement. The last thing we wanted to touch upon, just because it is fall, it is that time. A lot of you are engaging right now or thinking about engaging. This is when it says face-to-face, but the virtual meetings are happening with your largest investors to kind of assess which governance and comp practices are a priority. Essentially, everything that we discussed in this presentation is fair game. So keep that in mind when you are identifying, that prep session, for example, or those bullet points that you want to talk about. A lot of what we discussed, the human capital management, all of the spotlight, if you are in any environmental industry, and even just some of those governance developments, those are all fair game to discuss right now. And it kind of falls into this timeline of, going into winter where you're drafting your disclosures if your annual meeting's in the spring, right? And this year more than ever, that's probably going to be important. If you made any comp related adjustments, if you made any adjustments to your workforce, a lot of that is what investors are going to be looking at. Are you going to disclose anything that has affected you just because of the pandemic this year, and what you'll be doing going forward?
Yeah. And do you always encourage, Sally, for companies to engage? I mean, if they're on the fence, obviously certain companies have to engage. And certain companies are on the fence. Okay, should I put my, head out there if, we don't yet have a sustainability report, or, we're not doing everything, addressing everything in this deck. I don't know what I would say. I mean, what is your response to those clients?
That's a really good question. I think for the most part, companies are engaging, but there definitely are a few every year who say, you know what, we haven't really had any issues. Do we really want to, is it opening up Pandora's box? Do we really want to invite that criticism in? And my response is never one that they completely want to hear, because, in a sense, you are opening up Pandora's box. If there is something to criticize, you probably will hear it. But what I always end up saying is that, you don't have to concede to everything right away. You can make that more of a discussion. And where it really benefits you to do that engagement is that, you say that there's no issues at the moment, but say something comes up, right? Say you need a longer leash when it comes to executive compensation. Say it could be anything, right? If you do have that track record of reaching out to your investors, right? What we have literally seen is that, when something does come up and an investor sees that you've been reaching out, they do kind of give that longer leash, or they will say, we do have a good conversation with you every year. Like, talk to us about what you need and what you're doing. So there is that, it's kind of like a rainy day fund. If you start engaging now, to where, if you need that investor to be there for you later, there is an increased chance that they will be.
Thank you, Sally. I think
Yeah.
we might be out of time. Is that right, Jack?
Yes, we're at the top of the hour. So thank you, Maya and Sally, for your time. This is very informative presentation. To all of the ACC members, the CLE certificate for this presentation, as well as the presentation materials and a survey regarding this presentation will be sent in the next couple of days. Please look out for that. Again, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.